Some of you may or may not have heard me say that when I rewatch Voyager, and I have actually rewatched Voyager on multiple occasions, there are 3 episodes I skip each time I watch it. Threshold, which for anybody who knows anything about Star Trek in general, or indeed Voyager in specific, I shouldn't have to say anything else. Q in the Gray. Sometimes I'm iffy on that one. Occasionally I'll rewatch Q in the Gray because it's got its own fun moments and its own horribleness. And of course, John Delancey isn't exactly unpleasant to watch. And this one, Alliances. Before I watched this episode, I actually sat and listened to some music and tried to, for lack of a better word, meditate to try and clear my mind because I wanted to go into this as neutrally as possible. I'll be doing this for Threshold as well. I don't want to go in too preconceived. I don't want to go in prejudiced. You'll forgive me for using the literal definition of that word because prejudice does literally just mean to prejudge. I do not want to go in saying this is a bad episode. I want to go in saying this is an episode. Let's discuss it. Let's talk about it. And the results surprised me, and in the end made me more angry than I thought I would be. Let's talk about alliances. First, foremost, to my astonishment, I could not narrow it down to one good thing in this episode. I don't mean there weren't one good things. I mean there were several good things about this episode. To my amazement, I find myself genuinely enjoying much of the entire first half of the entire episode, the first 2 acts. I really did. Especially the first act. I know, right? Nobody was more shocked than I. So let's just talk about... rather than having a good stuff section, I'm just going to mention really quick what I thought was the highlight. And it is, in a nutshell, Chakotay. Chakotay, especially in the first chunk of this episode, really demonstrates Chakotay as I think he should have been, the character we should have had this entire time. I've mentioned before that every now and again Robert Beltran is allowed to act. I've said this for several of the actors, actually. And Chakotay actually does act like, a military commander of the Maquis who is former Starfleet and has interest in this and is pragmatic. And you get my point. He actually does a really good job of portraying that in this episode. And I actually wrote a note here that just says Chakotay has some balls, because I feel like that's what really is the difference here. In this episode, there's this one beautiful scene after there's a scene just after the mass, just after they or not the mass, the wake. What's the term for that? The guy died, and they had a meeting for it. I don't know what the term is for that. God, I'm an idiot. And just after that, there's a scene where Chakotay is talking to her. This was beautifully done. Because Janeway is pretty much stonewalling. I'll talk about this later. But Janeway is just flat on, binary mindset here, right? And Chakotay obviously disagrees with her, and he's already made this clear. But despite that, he never comes across as abrasive. He still approaches her diplomatically. He is still trying to reach her halfway. Despite the fact that he clearly disagrees with her, he is still doing his duty as a first officer and what he believes is his duty to his crew, the Maquis, and to his crew, the crew of the entire ship, if you understand what I mean here. I thought it was brilliantly done. The fact that he is willing to stand up to her and tell her, I think you're wrong, but I want to meet you halfway. I disagree with what you say, but I also disagree with him. Let's try to make this work. It was such a wonderful demonstration of what we should have had with Chakotay all this time. And that conveniently enough, leads me into my next point about the teaser. Let's get the bad out of the way first. Whoever directed this, I'm sorry, but having everyone constantly shout at each other just kind of ruined the scene for me. And when I say shout, I do mean shout, not alarmed voice, not oh my god, we need to do this, not urgency. People were shouting throughout pretty much the entire teaser. Oh my god, this has happened, Captain, we've got this going on over here, and it's that. And I get what they were going for was the energy of the moment, but it felt like it fell flat on my face. It fell flat on its face, or possibly my face. That might explain a few things. And on top of that, I will also mention this is getting nitpicky. I just feel like I have to mention it, or else Standing on principle, I have to mention it. Which is ironic if you know what this episode's about. Anyways, um, it is weird that the whole show they've just had this magic button over here that they could just go and everything's wiped clean, the ship's fine, the crew's fine, any energy problems are washed away, and it's fine. The magic reset button. But the problem is, I mean, that's great. That's great that they're finally showing consequence in this episode. They're showing the fact, they talk about we've been attacked, 3 times in the last few weeks or however much. Or 6 attacks. Excuse me, 6 attacks in the last week. The ship is getting damaged. We're having trouble getting the warp drive functional. Showing the consequence of being out here on their own with no backup. I'm with that. It just seems jarring because of the sheer contrast between it and all the episodes before and all the episodes after. Now, if you don't understand what I mean, I'm just going to put this into some kind of context. Immediately prior to this episode, I'm just going to pull up the list here. We had an episode called, we're just going to go with the first two, okay? The immediate prior episode to this is called Prototype, in which the Voyager ship gets so plastered and so destroyed by an alien vessel that the ship literally nearly is destroyed. And they start losing life support and decks and all that fun stuff, right? Absolutely plastered. Pasted, actually, is the word I'm going for. They had all that damage fixed within about a week in that episode. Then we have this episode where all of a sudden they've been attacked for weeks and, oh god, we can barely keep going after having been fine from the previous pasting. And then the next episode is Threshold, which, among its other problems, they create they make a shuttle that can go to warp infinity. I think you see my problem here and why I'm listing. I know this is getting a little nitpicky, but I do have to mention this because it's just so jarring. And that's really what it comes down to. If they wanted to pull the magic reset button constantly, which I guess they kind of do, I'd almost be more okay with that than the fact that every now and again they'll just bounce back and forth between consequences matter and magic reset button. And they'll do this a few more times until finally consequences start to actually matter. Basically about the point 7 and 9 shows up as a good example of that. Or the gift, if you want the episode name. That being said, let's talk about the good, because the teaser actually I really liked, all things considered. Other than the shouting, which really took me out of it. I was into it, and then people would be like, shout, but I will say that I like the fact that the battle scene at least tried to do something. It was still rather tepid, even by Star Trek standards, but at least they're firing back regularly. At least they actually managed to destroy an enemy ship and drive them off. At least they're doing something. And again, the way they demonstrate the battle damage, the way they demonstrate the consequence of this and all the other previous battles they've had, actually works pretty well, all things considered. Taurus having to shut down the warp drive, the warp core in order to prevent a breach, and them just barely being able to get thrusters and impulse functionally, all this fun stuff. All that not only makes sense, but is interesting and engaging in its own right. And of course, we get to see Tom Paris be competent again, because that's what Tom Paris is Mr. Competence. Wait until you see him in the next episode. Anyways. Furthermore, I do have to also point out something that this teaser actually does surprisingly well. It kills a red shirt. Now you may look at me and be like, well, why is that significant? Well, actually, I wasn't keeping track, but this is one of the first significant red shirt deaths that happened during Voyager. I know he doesn't actually have a red shirt, but my point is he was an NPC, a non-main character, not even a B or a C or a D-list character, just some guy we'd never seen before who died during the intro. But they portrayed it as something that mattered, and that's what they actually did right. They actually made the death of this completely random guy a significant part of the intro, and they made it. They showed more about Taurus with regards to it, and they introduced 2 recurring characters in the process, Michael Jonas and Hogan, both of whom we'll be seeing for the next several episodes all the way up until Basics. Well, actually, Michael Jonas will stop being around in Investigations, but Hogan will be around until Basics. So, props is what I'm trying to say. And this is actually my point. Star Trek cliches are not necessarily bad. It is how you implement them. The reason Voyager got so much flack, the reason why the term Magic Reset Button became a thing in Voyager is because even though TNG and original series did that stuff too, and so did DS9, before anybody leaps to mention that, they usually implemented it very well, or they executed it in such a way that you barely even notice. In Voyager, it's usually the exact opposite. It's so blatant and in your face that it's just mind-boggling the way it works. Now, I'm talking in generals. Of course, TNG screwed it up sometimes, and Voyager did it right sometimes. My point overall remaining is that this is an example of them doing a Trek cliche correctly. A red shirt dies, and it matters. They even have a significant portion of the plot dedicated to this guy's funeral, to a memorial service. And then they use that to examine the crew's dichotomy with each other. It gives us insight into Janeway and her character in a negative light, but nevertheless gives us insight into Chakotay's character, as I already mentioned, Chakotay actually being Chakotay and growing some frickin' balls. Overall, yeah, I'm with that. So props. Now, there's a couple other really great scenes here. Let's go ahead and talk about the. Before we get into the really big, this is probably gonna feel more like a Babylon 5 rumination than a Voyager rumination. I'll talk about why in a bit. But let's talk about a few other great scenes before we get to that. First of all, Tuvok and Janeway have a fantastic scene. I'm actually a big fan of Tim Russ, the guy who plays Tuvok. He's actually a really funny, goofy actor, and he's very charismatic, and it's ironic that he's probably one of the best, I'd say the second best actor to play a Vulcan in the history of the entire series, in my opinion, of the whole franchise. And I mean that sincerely. He is probably what I would point to say that is actually a Vulcan. Most of the time when you have an actor play a Vulcan, they either play them flat, or boring, or cold, or, an asshole, or something like that. Because, and I'm not even necessarily saying this is a bad thing, but it is actually hard to play the type of character. To play someone who is logical, but still has emotions and is just suppressing them. To play someone who is morality grown in and tempered with logic. Someone who is not boring, but someone who is very efficient. You get where I'm going with this. It's hard to play that kind of character. I certainly couldn't. So props to Tim Russ. And his chemistry, the chemistry between him and Janeway is amazing, and it's no wonder that the two of them have so many great scenes throughout the whole series, and it's no wonder that the two of them are such good friends in the character and backstory. I actually have a theory, which I've never been able to formally confirm, that due to the chemistry that Kate Mulgrew and Tim Russ had when they started filming, season 1 and the initial stuff, they started writing into the backstory the fact that they had always been friends, not just previous comrades, but actual friends, because of the way the two gelled so well together. So, definite props to that scene. I also want to give props to the bringing up the events of Star Trek VI in this. Usually, I would discourage that when you're comparing an episode I hate to one of my favorite movies of all time. Yes, Star Trek VI is genuinely one of my favorite movies of all time, easy in the top 10. Nevertheless, it was a stellar example of continuity. It was immediately relevant to the episode, and it was immediately relevant to demonstrate something not only about Tuvok, because as we know, Tuvok was actually there during those events, so he could speak to something of personal experience rather than just picking out a random history fact, and it was highlighting where Janeway's mindset was at. The way Janeway says it is beautiful. It's actually surprisingly well written, because she says, how do I abandon everything? She says other things, but one of the things she says is, how do I abandon everything I believe in? I don't know if I've talked about this extensively during my videos or my streams, but when I tend to use the word believe, I tend to use it, I feel like, a little bit more differently than most people, because I don't use it casually. In other words, I don't use it roughly, like, I believe in, whatever. Something you truly believe in is something that is central and core to your very essence, in my opinion, in my belief, if I could put it in such terms. It's something that is truly a part of who you are. When you strip away everything else, what is left is what you believe in. If I can quote Kingdom Come, for example, in DC Comics, when you strip away everything else about Batman, one of the things that is left there is that someone who doesn't want to see anyone to die, so doesn't want to see anyone else dying, because that's what he believes in, that life is sacred. You follow where I'm going with this? So I feel like it was actually an excellent way to demonstrate the situation Janeway is in and give her a much-needed depth to this episode, because, frankly, Janeway has come across in many instances as an uppity, smug twit. And that's me using kind words, because I'm still rather pissed off about this. But she comes across as so condescending and so, I am right, and therefore I am right, and I'm going to prove that I am right by arranging the circumstances such that I am right. I've talked about this before, female captain, blah blah blah, no need to retread that. In this episode we see another layer to that. She is saying we cannot abandon Starfleet principles and blah blah blah. But the problem is, principles and Starfleet and Federation laws and rules are literally just that, words. In this scene with Tuvok, we see that Janeway has a belief behind those words. For the first time, they actually show us that Janeway actually believes in the principles of the Federation. And I mention that because that's never actually been a thing before. She's just been rhetoric. She's been quoting rhetoric and dogma before this. But this is the first time that she's actually said, this is something I genuinely believe in. This is something I genuinely feel is a sacrosanct, you know? I like that. I like the added dimension to her character, and I like the dilemma it gives to her because she is torn between her desire to be a good captain and take care of her crew and fundamental caring of life, blah, 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 and her beliefs, which say that any action that could be taken to make this work is wrong. Deep Space Nine did this same thing with Benjamin Sisko in an episode that you've probably heard of called In the Pale Moonlight. Benjamin Sisko in that episode showed that he believed in Starfleet principles in their own way, in what is right and wrong, let's just put it that way. And in that episode, Benjamin Sisko realized that in order to accomplish what he wanted to, he was going to have to do something that he believed was wrong. Now obviously, Alliances doesn't have anywhere near the emotional punch that episode does. But it definitely highlighted and emphasized what Janeway was going through and how much it meant to her to finally go ahead and say, all right, we will try to ally ourselves with thugs and pirates and murderers. And let's make this clear, the Kazon are not nice people. Because we have to. Not because I want to, not because it's the right thing, but because pragmatism has won out. And that was powerful, in my opinion. And I was astonished. Like I said. I want to quote something, if I may. I actually wrote it down here before I forget about it. I really like this line because this is also a very Vulcan thing and a very Tuvok thing in a nutshell. Tuvok says, Janeway says, as soon as we leave this space, if this alliance ends, we're not going to be doing any good. They're just going to go back to fight. And Tuvok says, very likely. And the way Tim Russ puts the emphasis on this is perfect. I will try to emulate it, forgive me. Even a temporary stability can bring an appreciation for peace. In other words, the possibility exists that we will be doing good, even if it's not a guarantee, even if we don't know. I like that, and I really like the way the effort that was put into that. Let's talk about Michael Jonas. There is a subplot. It's actually the first subplot in all of Voyager, and it's one of the few across the whole series that has to do with Michael Jonas and Tom Paris. I'm going to spoil the whole thing for you because screw it. No, I'm actually not. But what I am going to say is that Michael Jonas, in all of the next episodes, yes, even Threshold, is going to play some kind of a role and is going to be interacting with certain of the crew members. And for some reason, Tom Paris is just going to spontaneously just kind of start being uppity and aggravating. He's just going to be up in their faces. He's going to start getting more and more lethargic about his work, that sort of thing, right? I want to say two things positive about this. First of all, subplot's good. I just like to say that in general. I like that idea of continuity, and I like that idea of having some kind of episode-to-episode thread that connects them. I do, and I'm with that fully. There's one other thing, though, that I like about it, and that is the fact that you can't do this sort of thing until you have established first. This is actually something I was just thinking about with regards to my D&D campaign. Until you have an established character or setting or group, the audience will not appreciate a change. They will not understand the significance of it. But because for the last season and a half we've seen Tom Paris being, Tom Paris, him suddenly acting like this is noteworthy and significant. And we don't know if this is character growth or development or arc or whatever, but something is clearly off. Something is clearly wrong or different or changing. And we wouldn't have that if not for the fact that they'd already established the character. And so I think this is a pretty good time to really start doing this sort of thing. So again, props. Several people at the time, myself included, were, guessing what's going on, what's happening with Tom, So I just wanted to mention that. I want to talk about something really quick. Like I said, that's basically it for the episode, I'll be honest with you. You're probably wondering why I hate this episode so much. Well, I guess we'll talk about the speech first, even though the speech pisses me off the most, and is the big reason why I hate this episode. In real life, there are a few types of people, or a few actions that people take that piss me off more than other things do. We're all like this. We all have our little either pet peeves or real peeves, as I like to call them. The difference, if you're wondering, is a pet peeve is something that you don't have any real fundamental reason to bother you. It just does. A real peeve is something that actually has an impact on you and then bothers you. Someone driving recklessly would be a real peeve. Someone tapping their fingernails on a desk would be a pet peeve. To give you really, really dumb examples. This is, so we all have real peeves, we all have pet peeves. This is arguably a pet peeve, I'll admit that. I really, 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 really do not like it when someone is so sanctimonious and so self-assured and so smug about it, and they say, I'm not going to give you a specific example because I don't feel like it. A, okay? They say A. And I look at them, I say, in my own usual thing, because I try to be reasonable, well, A is not correct. B, C, or D, or F, or G, or X, or Z are correct. No, A. And then they go out of their way to prove that A is correct by sabotaging all efforts to prove the contrary. I guess this is going to not really work with an exception, but it's hard to describe properly. You'll forgive me, but it really is a self-fulfilling thing. They make A happen, and then they use the fact that they made A happen as proof that A is correct. And then they come back to you and are immediately just smug and in your face about it, and I was right all along because I made A happen. But they don't say it like that, of course. That just pisses me off. Well, I just got to say that it is very indicative when the very writer of this episode, Jerry Taylor herself, Jerry Taylor, someone who I have not exactly spoken well of to date, and someone who is very much one of the biggest negative influences on the Janeway character up to date, really didn't like the end speech she gave Janeway in this episode. Jerry Taylor really didn't like the net result of this. Think about that. Because her final speech is so dripping with condescending, smug superiority. The only allies we need out here are Federation principles. I'm actually getting mad again. The reasons why that pissed me off, I've already gone over the big one. It's because she screwed up the alliance discussion twice, actually, and then refused to ever make a third go of it or try again or otherwise do anything. She literally just said, "Nope, I was right all along." And I hope the way she says it, I hope we've all learned a valuable lesson in these events. I wanted to smack her, and the way it's presented is so overt that it's clear that this is not the character talking to the other characters. There's a concept in writing where I don't know the term for it, forgive me, but the idea is one character talking to another, and the two are talking to each other in a way that makes sense for the characters. And then there's the two characters are talking, and it's obvious that they're talking to the viewer, or the reader, or the audience, or whatever, the person that is actually perceiving this fictional work. And sometimes the two can mesh, of course, especially if you're a good writer. But it was so obvious this was being told not to the rest of the cast, but to us. It was preachy. I don't like being preached to by someone who is provably wrong. And the way it just throws away everything that happened that was good about this episode. All the development about Chakotay, all the interest about the character development and Janeway's conflict, everything that happened between her and her interactions and everything else, all of the consequences of being out here on their own, all of the backstory we learned about the Kazon and the Trabe, everything about this, all of this is literally just thrown out the window because I was right all along. Now, I'm going to quote Sci-Fi Debris here because I think it's very appropriate. Forgive me. I hope you will all see that I was correct in not making an alliance with anyone. Now I want you to fast forward about a season and a half. I want you all to know that I was correct in making an alliance with the Borg. Moving on. That one scene pissed me off so much. The episode, which I had at least been sort of enjoying up to this point, that just destroys it. It just ruins it. It spits on it. It's the Mass Effect 3 thing all over again. Well, okay, no, it isn't, because the rest of Mass Effect 3 had its own problems. But you get my point. Okay, it was the Neverwinter Nights 2 thing. That's another bad example. Whatever, you get the problem. You get to the end, and it is just so... It just gets you right across the knees and ruins so much of it for you. And that's why I skipped this episode when I rewatched this damn series, is because of that freaking sanctimonious speech she gives at the end. And the way it's just presented and executed and built up to. It's just... Let's move on. I said this would be kind of more of a Babylon 5 review. I know I've been kind of talking about the episode as a whole, but the reason I say that is in Babylon 5, I'm not really going to be talking about the episode so much as the characters, the arc, and the concepts that are brought up in that. There are two things I'd like to talk about in this one. One of them is actually a fascinating topic that is brought up by this episode, and the other one is something that has been forwarded by Star Trek fans for many years. I am not the first or the second or the fifth or the 20th person to repeat this, so I am not taking credence for this, but I agree and disagree. I'll talk about that last. Let's talk about human adaptability versus human principles, okay? Now, I go ahead and openly say that I believe that everything depends on the circumstances. That sometimes it is worth standing on your principles, even if it means negativity, even if it means no net positive, even if it means, it's just going to be a waste. Sometimes the circumstances are different, so that if you are willing, if the circumstances fit it, maybe you should compromise your principles. Maybe you should accept the negative option because of pragmatism or because of realism or whatever. That's my take on it in a nutshell. But it is an interesting debate to be brought up, because what we essentially have in this episode as a whole is that exact discussion. What is more important in this situation? What is more important? Our principles of being decent people? And that's how it's demonstrated. Yes, I know that's not actually what they mean. Starfleet principles, let's not get into that discussion, okay? Let's just take it at face value. The principles mean being decent people and not getting involved with the affairs of others, which, let's even just eject that second one, because that's not even relevant. And the pragmatism of the situation of, again, allying with thieves, murderers, pirates, brigands, thugs. These are not nice people. Neither are the Trabe. They just are better at hiding it. But the point I'm trying to get across here is, which do you choose? If you were the captain, which would you choose? Because it's not as easy. I think the episode deserves props for making this dilemma sit here, because it's not actually that easy of a question. Really, in my opinion. It is not something that there is no overtly obvious answer. You don't just obviously say, well, duh, I'm going to sacrifice my principles. Let's go! Because there's long-term consequences. There's short-term consequences. There's the reality of what you are doing. The reality of what you are betraying. And I'm not talking about some piece of paper that some diplomats wrote 100 years ago. I'm talking about what you believe in, what you care about. And at the same time, your people are dying. And you are barely functioning in any kind of status. You're lucky to have warp drive. Warp drive. Try to think about that for a moment. Try to think of what it'd be like to go without warp drive and spend a few, 100 years going anywhere at all. Spend like 9 years getting the next system in hopes of getting it repaired. You get my point. It is an interesting question, and I'm not actually going to say myself which answer is right or correct or anything. I'm not even going to tell you which I would choose in this specific circumstance, because that's not the point of this. The point is to engage you, my viewer, about what I think the viewers of this episode should really be thinking about and should really take away from this episode. Where do you draw the line, or do you draw a line? Do you say, I will not cross this line? Do you say, I will never cross this line? Absolute. 100%. Do you say, I will cross this line if A, B, or C? Do you say, this is what I am willing to accept? There are so many gradients of gray in this topic, and it's such a shame that they didn't explore this more. And again, like I said, this is why I liken this to Babylon 5, because this is the exact sort of thing Babylon 5 ought like to bring up. This kind of concept, this philosophical discussion, Do we, as people, sentient beings, have the right to do evil in order to accomplish good? Or should we always stick to good, even at the loss of our own survival? Or something in between, you know? I'm, I don't really have much more to add, I'm afraid. I just think it's a fascinating topic and one worth discussion. Oh, I'm sorry, I have one other note here. I really should have mentioned this earlier. It is literally, quote, and I quote, Neelix actually being useful? And there's like 3 exclamation points here. I do have to give props for this episode. In the meeting room, Neelix actually mentions something that I like a lot. He says, you know, we're near a planet. I know a particular Kazon on that planet. He owes me a few favors. I could use him to try and get the ear of the Maj, and we can try and reach out and decide, or feel out, excuse me, and figure out if the Kazon at all would be interested in an alliance before we actually, you know, open ourselves up to the Kazon and all the risks that entails. I actually really like that. That makes sense. It's logical. It's useful. It's helpful. It's actually Neelix being Neelix. Holy crap! So we've got Chakotay being Chakotay, Neelix being Neelix, and yes and no on Janeway being Janeway, and Tuvok being Tuvok. Let's talk about the death of Star Trek. That's the last topic. A lot of people have said that in hindsight, alliances is where Star Trek died. I'm not sure I agree with that or not. It is my opinion that Voyager still had good stuff after this. It is my opinion that Enterprise still had good stuff after this. But at the same time, even in that mindset, even giving them fairness and even trying to be equal-minded about it and trying to be neutral about it, I have to admit, never again would the spark of what I truly loved about Star Trek happen from this point on. I actually probably before this, but this is the episode that most clearly defines the death knell, and I do tend to agree with that. I'm sure many of you have already heard about this concept, so forgive me for rehashing it. But the long and the short of it is, alliances established that the status quo was law. TNG, Deep Space Nine, and the original series, as well as the movies, were never afraid about shaking things up. And they would do so on semi-frequent occasion, and all of the incidents when they did so were generally considered some of the best incidents of all of Star Trek. The death of Spock in Wrath of Khan, the war with the Klingons and the subsequent peace in the original series, the Borg's introduction and the way they changed not only Star Trek out of universe, but Star Trek in universe in Next Generation, the Dominion and everything that they meant for challenging the very soul and heart of the Federation in Deep Space Nine. Star Trek has often been a show that both in character, in universe, and out has challenged and changed and moved and grown. And yet, here in this episode, we see that at this point in time, Star Trek has become Walmart. Or McDonald's, actually, would probably be a better example. Some of you may not remember this, but when McDonald's really started getting going, about 3 decades ago, I'd say at this point, the big selling point for McDonald's was that no matter which McDonald's you went to, a Big Mac was a Big Mac. That sounds kind of weird now, but that was actually a selling point at the time. That kind of standardization was very unusual, and it was pretty much new. In fact, some of you also probably don't remember this, but once upon a time, if you wanted your meal customized at McDonald's, they would say no. The reason Burger King got its foot in the door was because have it your way was their slogan. They were actually willing to change your order for you to have no pickles or no tomatoes or whatever. Yes, really. I mean, I know this is weird, but I find it interesting to look back, and see how things were back then. My point I'm trying to get across here is McDonald's was standardized. It was uniform. And that's kind of what Star Trek had become after this point in time. While there is still good, and there's still enjoyable episodes, and one enjoyable movie, or 2 actually. I'm not sure if First Contact came before or after this. I think it was before. It doesn't matter. The point I'm trying to get across here is that they never really tried anything new after this point, with the one and sole exception being the Xindi arc. Yes, I know some of you are going to mention that to me. It's unfortunate that that didn't actually save the show like it should have. An idea that's been tossed around a lot is that alliances really should have been the turning point in Voyager, and the fact that it wasn't is the ultimate caricature of Voyager as a series in a nutshell. I've said this 1,000 times before. Voyager, one of the things that's so irksome about it is because it has so much potential, and it does so little with it. Alliances had the potential to truly change the status quo. Take that name, Alliances, and everything it means. Even when this episode came out, I know I'm not the first person to say this, but I can say it definitively. When this episode came out, I actually thought this would begin basically the idea of founding a new federation. The very beginnings of a new federation, an alliance of the races that we've encountered, or some of the races we've encountered, out in the Delta Quadrant, with Voyager being the one to tie them together. It seemed fitting, it seemed interesting, it seemed long-term affecting, it seemed risky, but the thought engaged me. Imagine what Voyager would be like if they had done that instead. Imagine what Voyager would be like, even if it became more of a backdrop to the next season, 2 seasons, season and a half, really. Imagine if it became a thing where each Voyager would be going as a representative of this new federation, and they would have the backing of some of those members, and they would be called upon to back some of those members. It would make several events make more sense, I might add, like the events of Basics, for example, when they talk with the Talaxians and get them to assist against the Kazon faction who has taken Voyager. Just to use one example right off the top of my head. Think about how Warlord would have gone if Voyager was actually here to court these people for diplomatic purposes and ends up helping them with this little civil debate, and then, as a resultant of that, gains their allegiance, gains their alliance within this federation. Imagine what flavor that would have added to the next season and a half until the gift, in which point Voyager is sent off, and we are left with the impression that Voyager has left the Delta Quadrant, or at least tried to leave it better than they found it, because they founded the basics of this federation. And imagine the potential of what that would mean. If you'll forgive me for quoting the original series, it would be interesting to return someday and see what crop has been sown, or what crop has grown from this seed you've sown. Do you not agree with this? I mean, I'm sorry, I say that incorrectly because I agree with this a lot. I think that would have been perfect. I think it would have been great, and I think it would have really finally firmly established Voyager as a true Star Trek show rather than a Star Trek show, kinda. Yeah, and indeed, in many people's minds, it's just kind of pathetic. I'm probably one of the more kindly disposed towards it. Such immense potential. As you're probably imagining, the original changes in the Imperium storyline, this was going to be a wildly different episode. Alliances was. This was going to involve when the several factions that have been introduced to date had actually allied in array against Voyager in what is effectively a last-ditch effort, which would gather just a little bit too much attention and noise and would bring the full attention of the Conclave down on the Voyager. And from here on out, the overall arc would become more of a Conclave arc than anything else. But all I have to say about my page 1 rewrite, which I've been doing, is everything I just said. Honestly. Get rid of the sanctimoniousness. Flesh out the Janeway character just a little bit more. Don't fall back onto that. Oh, I'm right on the soapbox routine, and instead have them succeed in actually forging a real alliance out here. Why not have several sects of the Kazon be more reasonable? Certainly violent, certainly savage, as they've had to be out here in the wild, so to speak, but reasonable, willing to think, willing to function. Why not have, after the Trabe's betrayal, have some of the Trabe come back? Instead of making that the climax, make that about the middle point of the episode, and have some of the Trabe come back and say, we're not with them. We do not have allegiance to that. We do not think that we should kill away all our problems. And so forth and so on. Imagine the potential if they had actually gotten this together and have the actual climax of the episode be the signing of the new Federation, or whatever you want to call it, the Delta Quadrant Alliance Charter. And imagine having the very end of the episode have the coda between Janeway and Tuvok again, and have them talk about how they have no idea, the full extent of what they've done here today. But then have Janeway say something along the lines of, I can't wait to find out where this goes next. And I am hopeful. Just, Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and cut this off. Alliances, ladies and gentlemen. I will talk to you soon.